Good evening and welcome to tonight's program, State and Local Budget Projections and Their Future Impact on Legislation. This program is presented by the League of Women Voters of Montgomery County. I'm Diane Habino, co-president. Two guests are with us to talk about the impact of COVID-19 on state and local budget revenues and expenditures, and to answer your questions about future budgeting. Before I introduce the speakers and turn the meeting over to them, let's review a couple of housekeeping details. This meeting is being recorded, and the recording will be available on the League of Women Voters YouTube channel. The address is in the chat box. There will be a Q&A session after the speakers have concluded their presentations. We encourage you to submit questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Questions cannot be submitted via the chat box. Instead, type your question into the Q&A box and hit send or return. We will answer as many questions as time allows. This program is scheduled to end by 8:30. Tonight's speakers are Maryland State Treasurer Nancy Kopp and County Council Member Andrew Friedson. We will begin with Nancy Kopp. She's a graduate of Wellesley and the University of Chicago, and she represented the Bethesda area in the Maryland House of Delegates for 27 years. In 2002, she was elected state treasurer, the second woman to serve in this position, and she's currently in her fifth term. She is the state's CFO, Chief Financial Officer, and oversees banking and investment of Maryland funds and the issuance of state debt, and serves on many significant state level boards. Nancy Kopp is one of the League of Women Voters 2020 Lavinia awardees. Lavinia Engel was a suffragist and the first woman to represent Montgomery County in the Maryland House of Delegates. So we honor her legacy in saluting Nancy Kopp for her contributions to the League's goals of making democracy work. It is now my pleasure to invite Ms. Kopp to begin tonight's program. Please begin.
Thank you, Diane. Let me just take a moment to thank the League and say how proud I am. Lavinia Engel was a great woman, a leader among women. And in fact, there is a Lavinia Engel Scholarship Fund, which I'm sure Diane can tell everybody about if they don't know, and contributes to educating women at all of our universities, but we're focusing on Montgomery College and Montgomery County women of all ages. I also have to say, in a personal note, many decades ago, when I was a young child, the one organization my mother belonged to was the League of Women Voters of Chicago. And I have to tell you, I hated the League because once a month on Wednesday nights, we had frozen food. This was before modern frozen food, and it was always chicken pot pie. And I have never been really wild about chicken pot pie since then, but I have been wild about the League. When we moved here in 1963, my mother and I took a course from the League on Know Your County. I don't know if you still have Know Your County, but it was terrific. It really gave you a wonderful bird's eye view of Montgomery County and Maryland. And so I always think of the League really as home, which is good and bad, but also as the great educator of government in the county and nationally. Let me just take a minute. I'm sure that people who are watching this, especially League members, know about our system in Maryland for revenue estimates and budgeting, but just to touch base for a moment, Maryland is unique. We have a treasurer who is elected by the General Assembly, a comptroller elected at large, obviously the governor elected at large, and a system which some might say is too concentrated, but we think not, and is one of the reasons we have a AAA bond rating. Maryland has a traditional view of the importance of consensus in estimating and running a fiscal system throughout the year based on consensus. So the first thing we do is have a board of revenue estimates, which is made up of the comptroller, the treasurer, and the governor's representative. It's the secretary of budget. And based on the numbers that come into the Bureau of Revenue Estimates, which is in the comptroller's office, throughout the year we meet and we make projections that are based on the recommendations of that bureau, plus the models, Moody's, and all the other people who go into projecting. And in September and then in December, we make projections which the governor puts in his budget. And unlike most states, in Maryland, the governor must use those consensus-based numbers to send the budget to the legislature. So we don't have Democratic numbers and Republican numbers, legislative numbers and executive numbers. We have one consensus number. The governor sends the budget down. The legislature can only cut it, and until this year was not able to move funds around. The Constitution was changed in the last election. But the bottom line is based on the projections of the Board of Revenue Estimates. And then off of that runs capital debt affordability and a number of other numbers. But it's all based on nonpartisan, non-institution-based numbers. So that's our system. It's unique, and it's served us very well, I believe. You mentioned that the treasurer is the chief financial officer, but actually there are two chief financial officers in Maryland. The comptroller, whose function is to collect the taxes and keep the books of the state, and the treasurer, who does the banking and investing and then reconciles what we have with what's on the comptroller's books. We do many other things too, but that is the department of the Treasury of those parts. To get to your specific question, yes, we were hit very hard by the pandemic, and it's impacted our finances very significantly, but not entirely in the way that we had anticipated. The bottom line for right now is that because we believe it's because of the quick federal action in the beginning, which is winding its way through the entire economy, and now with the last congressional action, I hope will be spurred on, although we don't believe it's sufficient. But because of that, and because of the way this money then transfers, for instance, people got individual $1,200 checks in the beginning of the year. Those were people who really needed those checks. And by and large, they weren't saved. They were put into the economy. And so the economy thrived on that, and in addition to all the other federal and state programs. So after making the traditional estimate in March, in April, the comptroller had a press conference and made projections. They weren't the joint BRE projections, made his own projections of really dire circumstances, a negative $2 billion in that year. We came back in May and said, we don't think it's $2 billion. Our joint, if unofficial, estimate is down about a billion. By the time we ended the year, actually, it was not down that much at all. It was several hundred million less than we had thought a year ago, but it was not down that far. And then when we met in September, it turned out our projections in May had actually been conservative. And we just met with the staff, the Bureau of Revenue Estimate Secretary, a brilliant man with whom we're very fortunate to have working for us, Andrew Schauffel. And we think that those December estimates, which were an increase over what we had thought in the past, at the very least will hold. And perhaps they were slightly conservative themselves. We aim to be conservative because you don't want to overspend. But on the other hand, you want to be very real. So the news that I would bring you right now is we are expecting growth in this fiscal year. And perhaps next year too, if the federal government continues on the path that it seems to be on right now. Maryland still has fiscal problems. We have some built-in spending, including education and other things that we want to spend on. And the question is modernizing and making sure that our revenue structure, tax and fee structure, mirror the 21st century, which the legislature is moving to do. If we can keep things as they are now, it looks difficult but doable and much better than we thought it was several months ago. That basically is where we are. Maryland, a couple of other points. Maryland is very fortunate because we have, first of all, a good, simple governmental structure. We have 23 counties in the city of Baltimore, and each county is a taxing district, and each county also is the education district. So we don't have boards of education, different districts with millages and other taxes and fees. It's a simple, clear structure. And at each level, we have a what used to be called the three-legged stool. I don't know if it's still called that now, but at the state level, we have the income tax, the sales tax, and a very small property tax, which goes into backing debt that we use for capital expenditures. And the county has income tax, major property tax, and some other taxes, not a traditional sales tax, but taxes on certain services and events. And because they're balanced, we're not, some states advertise that they don't have a sales tax or they don't have an income tax, but that does mean, because you have a complex economy, that states that don't have income taxes but depend on sales taxes are in bad shape when sales taxes are down. Or states like ours, although we're changing, who tax only goods and not services, when you're changing from a product-based economy to a service economy, have a lot of problems also. So we are fortunate. We inherited from our foremothers good governmental and economic system. And as I'm sure Andrew will tell you, a very good education system, which allowed us then to have a well-educated workforce, which means a flexible workforce, which is able to change as circumstances change. As we change, for instance, from manufacturing to service, the capacity to change, which is why from a finance, economic perspective, it is so important to keep investing in the education system at all levels. So that's a picture of where we are at the state right now.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm sure there will be questions afterwards to Nancy Kopp, but now we'll turn to our second speaker, Councilmember Andrew Friedson. He represents Council District 1, which stretches from the DC line all the way to Frederick County to the border in western Montgomery County. He was elected in 2018 and serves on 2 council committees, the FED, which is Planning, Housing, and Economic Development, and Government Operations and Fiscal Policy. Prior to joining the council, Mr. Friedson served as Senior Policy Advisor and Deputy Chief of Staff to the Comptroller of Maryland. On the council, he has spearheaded legislation to ensure that all county bills include a thorough economic analysis and to strengthen financial oversight by requiring a regular review of spending by all county departments and agencies. He will speak on local budget projections as they are impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. Mr. Friedson.
Thank you, Diane. Thank you to the League for not just this event tonight, but for all of your work to inform voters. You really are the leader on engaging citizens in what is happening in government, and certainly now as much as ever, having a straight down the middle, substantive, trusted organization where engaged citizens and residents can turn to is so valuable. And I just want to thank you for all of your work, all of your efforts on this and on so many important issues in our community, in our county, in our country. And I'm reminded here, humbled to be on a panel with a mentor and friend in Treasurer Kopp. I am reminded of in 1962, I wasn't around for it, but one of my favorite lines, John F. Kennedy assembled every living Nobel laureate and said, "This is the most extraordinary collection of talent and human knowledge ever gathered here at the White House, with the possible exception of when Thomas Jefferson dined here alone." And I feel like this is the greatest assembly of public budget experts that you have ever assembled since Nancy Kopp did this alone last time. So I'm not sure how much I'm really adding, but really to be joined by the treasurer, somebody I really look up to and admire, and one of the most accomplished women in the history of the state, one of the most accomplished budget experts that we have in our state, who we're lucky enough to have in Montgomery County. I just feel really fortunate, really lucky, and feel like I'm not quite deserving of standing shoulder to shoulder here, but I will do my best.
Let me just interrupt to say it is mutual, and I wasn't going to go into Andrew, but I first met Andrew Friedson when he was one of the very first, maybe the first student on the Board of Regents. And he came and testified in Annapolis on an issue that was, I honestly don't remember the issue, but it was very emotional, and there were people on both sides, and they wanted to string each other up. And Andrew came in with a proposal to bring people together, to work out problems, to address, and he succeeded. And that was the first of many experiences with Andrew and his great political success. I am a major Friedson fan.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Madam Treasurer. So I have some slides. I want to walk through the county fiscal picture, the broad picture here as we're talking is that the state's budget picture is a lot better than what was anticipated. The county's is not quite as rosy. One of the main reasons of that is the sales tax. The move in the state to have online sales tax collection has been a major boon to the state. The other major difference is that there's been a shift from services to products to goods, which are taxed by the state. Those two things are significant benefits to the state, which is a net positive, but they don't have any downward impact, any downward benefit to the county. And so some of the main things that are really propping up that are much better than expected in the most dire of projections and some of the previous conservative projections, unfortunately, the county isn't necessarily going to be a direct beneficiary of that, although obviously having the state be in better fiscal shape is significant for the county, because when the state has fiscal problems, oftentimes it passes the buck to the county, as we've seen previously with the pension shift to the county, other burdens, and also having state support cut off or reduced or minimized, has a significant impact on the county's ability to provide services, highway user funds, to pay for maintenance of our roads, for instance, education funding, et cetera. So I just wanted that's kind of the big picture. They're related, but they are different because, as you heard the treasurer mention earlier, what we collect taxes from primarily is quite different. And particularly our reliance, about half our budget is property tax, about 47%, a little less than that, but close, is income tax. We have a 3.2% piggyback tax off your state income tax. And then the remaining balance, we have a very small number, are a series of other taxes and fees. One of them, for instance, being the energy tax, which is a tax on commercial buildings. So let me just quickly go through. There's a lot of numbers here, so I'll give the specifics, and then we'll make sure we're providing the big picture as well. But we're projecting a $143.3 million gap between revenues and expenditures for the remainder of fiscal year 21 that ends on June 30th. That is a significant number for a county budget. It's a $6 billion budget, which sounds like quite a lot, but in terms of discretionary spending in the budget, we really only have about $897 million, just under $900 million that's discretionary, that we can adjust, change, cut with relative ease, so to speak, relatively quickly without major policy changes. For instance, our debt obligations, we can't change the debt we've already incurred in the service that we have to pay on that debt, the expense of that debt. Potential $90.7 million gap for fiscal 22. So that's starting July 1st. On top of the $143.3 million, we're projected to basically start, so to speak, in the hole, about $91 million. And then we have additional pandemic-related revenue reductions, that we still don't know the full picture of. For instance, commercial property tax revenue due to tenant and revenue losses. So just to give you a sense of that, residential properties are charged by how much a comparable property around you could sell for, or how much your property could sell for, more or less. It's not a perfect system, but that's generally how it works. Commercial properties is based on the income of the commercial property. So if a retailer goes out of business, if a restaurant goes out of business, that local retail shop is usually on what's called a triple net lease, meaning that the shop itself pays for the property tax, not the building owner. So the county would see a reduction in that. The person who owns the building would effectively appeal, saying that they don't have a tenant anymore, anybody who's paying for that. If they have less occupancy in commercial buildings, that means they'll pay less in commercial taxes. Unlike in your home, if you were to lose your job, your property tax wouldn't change and wouldn't be impacted. And so that could be a very quick change for us. You heard the treasurer talk about the difference. If there's a shift between a mom and pop local store spending and big box retailers or online, the state's still collecting a 6% sales tax on your dollar of spending. But the county is not getting the benefits of a local store that may be going out of business because you're no longer going into an actual store to make that purchase. And so it is a significant impact on the local county fiscal picture. Let's go to the next slide. So the revenue pressures, $57.5 million is projected to be income tax revenue losses for obvious reasons. This is one of the toughest economies in terms of unemployment, people losing their jobs. It's particularly hit hourly employees, service workers, et cetera. 18.9 million projected reduction in recordation and transfer tax revenue. That's when a sale of property occurs. The recordation tax on residential property is actually going fairly well. As you may have heard, the residential real estate market is pretty good, but the commercial real estate market is quite bad. It's very challenged, and so that is the projection there. $17 million projected losses in hotel motel tax. Needless to say, the hotel and hospitality industry has been hit particularly hard during this pandemic, and that has an impact not only on those businesses, but also on the county and the hotel motel tax. Again, we'll also see a hit not just on the hotel motel tax that is paid, but on the commercial property tax for those properties that's paid as well. So those are kind of a double hit, so to speak, for the county's bottom line. And then 6.4 million projected reduction in energy tax revenue. Fewer buildings are open, fewer buildings are being occupied and used to the same degree, means that they're using less energy. That's positive for the climate and for carbon reductions, but it is a net negative to the energy tax collection. As people are using their energy at home, there's no energy tax collection there. It's charged only on commercial properties, and so that is actually the third largest revenue, tax revenue that is collected. It's by far smaller than income tax and property tax, but it is the third largest, and so that's a significant reduction there. Next slide, please. So expenditure pressures, we are taking in less money and we're spending more money, which leads to a challenge, obviously, that needs to be addressed. One of the major drivers of the additional costs is a county executive negotiated differential pay. This is COVID-19 emergency pay for public employees who are front facing, either in the office or public facing in and out of an office. At the end of the fiscal year, or excuse me, at the end of the calendar year, ending January 1st, that was $77.7 million spent in COVID-19 differential pay. It's a huge expense to the county. It's $10 an hour for those coming into contact with people, and $3 an hour if you're working in an office and not necessarily coming into contact with the public. Our current fiscal analysis projects it to be another $45 million between January 1st and June 30th, the second half of the year. So a substantial expense moving forward, unless there's a change to circumstances or a change to that agreement. Just to give you a sense, last budget during the crisis, the council did not approve any pay increases, did not furlough or lay off any public employees, but did not take pay increases. We donated our own pay increases back to the county, and none of the pay increases for public employees were accepted because of the uncertain fiscal picture that we had in order to hopefully avoid the need for furloughs and layoffs and other issues. To give you a sense, that was $22.4 million, the cost of those originally negotiated pay increases that were negotiated before the pandemic occurred. The differential pay alone is 3.5 times already more than that, and we're only halfway into the fiscal year right now. It's annualized at $100 million. If it goes through the end of the fiscal year, it'll be about $125 million. So it's a substantial number to give you a sense. We've applied for FEMA reimbursements of $31.2 million of that, but we have yet to get a determination of what we will be reimbursed for. The executive branch has been hopeful that much of the differential pay and many of our expenses will be covered 75% by the federal government through the FEMA reimbursement for emergency pay. But as I have said before, hope is not a fiscal strategy. And we still don't know exactly what the number is going to be of exactly what gets covered. And that leaves us with a significant hole and a lot of questions of how we fill it. In addition to that, we've approved more than $250 million in emergency appropriations to assist residents and businesses directly impacted by the pandemic. Almost all of that, not all of it, but almost all of it has been funded through federal CARES Act funding. We got $183 million directly to the county government, and then some indirect funding to the federal government. If we're going to continue that level of support or anywhere close to it, we're going to need additional support from the federal government. The second CARES Act funding that was recently passed, it did not include, similar to the $183 million, direct support for the county, but it does have some of the indirect support for the county, like for K through 12 education, for child care, some of the things for transit, for instance, through WMATA. Last time we got about $31 million for the ride on bus service. And so we're hopeful that we will get that. We expect to get that, but those are for specific expenses, not really to help fill the county's budget gaps itself. And so that still remains to be seen. Everything else has been paid for out of reserves. The good news is the council and the county previously had done a good job of building up reserve. We have one of the highest reserves in the country at 10% of total gross revenues, about $550 million in reserves. That has put us in a much stronger position than we otherwise would have been. But those reserves are to cover revenue shortfalls, which we are now only in the beginning of seeing. We're going to see revenue shortfalls this fiscal year, next fiscal year, and most likely for 2 or 3 fiscal years that follow. Next slide, please. They're referred to as savings plans, but a revised spending plan. This is a mid-year budget cut. It was submitted on Friday, literally 3 days ago. It was much smaller than some of us had anticipated, given the magnitude of the fiscal challenges. 16.4 million out of the current operating budget and 8.6 million out of the capital budget. That's a total of 25 million. The operating budget is a much more significant piece here. The reductions are mostly lapse savings due to leaving vacant positions open, reductions in some in-person services that have been shut down or decreased. Largely, these are accounting changes. They are not necessarily actual savings because the money was not being spent, for instance, on a vacant position. It's just formalizing the fact that that money wouldn't be spent. Some of that is important to do from an accounting and budget planning standpoint, but it doesn't quite make the cuts that would be needed ultimately to be able to address the full magnitude of the fiscal challenges that we currently face. Next slide, please. So there's some good news here compared to the Great Recession, as you heard at the state level as well. The county's fiscal health is much stronger than it was then, largely because we made some tough decisions prior to me being on the council, and because we have more help from the federal government, certainly, than we had then, which is a substantial change than we did. It's important to note, though, that the big hit to the county's budget from the Great Recession didn't occur for about 18 months. When Lehman Brothers fell, it was August of 2008. It wasn't until 18 months later, when the fiscal 2011 budget came, which was March of 2010, that the revenues were so much lower than were expected and projected that County Executive Leggett at the time, almost days after he had sent the original budget over, said, ignore that budget, I'm going to send you a new one, because at this point it is irrelevant because we have lacked the funds in order to pay for it. So the county is effectively a lagging indicator of a lagging indicator of things that are happening in the actual economy with residents and families. The other really good news is that voters overwhelmingly supported Question A to reform and simplify the county's property tax law. That allows us to collect revenue from natural growth in property values, basically growing the tax base, not necessarily tax rates. Moody's immediately after Question A passed and Question B failed, rated that as a credit positive for the county's fiscal health long term. That's a significant boon. And then obviously the fact related to this, the county has held a AAA bond rating since 1973. We're the longest continuous AAA bond rating of any municipal government in the United States. And it's largely due to some of these fiscal decisions that have been made, our ability to weather storms just like the one that we're in. And then obviously, as I mentioned before, the $183 million from the federal government has been a significant impact, largely to be able to provide significant relief to struggling businesses and vulnerable residents that we've been able to do. We would not have been able to do anything close to what we have done already, and hopefully we'll be able to do more without the federal government stepping in and providing us with support. Next slide. And just quick overview of some of those COVID relief packages, about $5 million, which came from the state, restaurant relief. Recently, 6.2 million came from the state for hotel relief. Those are two programs that are happening right now. 1.2 million to provide some of the outdoor areas to help restaurants and retailers $5 million tourism stabilization grant, which has helped our arts and culture and recreation organizations that have been closed the entire time, have not been able to open for 9 months, would not be able to survive another 3 to 6 months or potentially longer. We have a $20 million rent relief program, $25 million for food assistance, $25 million for the public health emergency grant program that we did all the way back in March to help businesses at the outset of that that I actually authored myself. So that's the fiscal picture. Here's our contact information. Happy to answer questions, any of those that you may have. The broad news is we face some fiscal headwinds, some real challenges. We've put ourselves in a position to be able to weather the storm, but we have to make tough decisions now in order to do it. And it's going to be difficult. It's going to be a lot of shared sacrifice, and we're going to have to figure out a way to get through it together, as Montgomery County has before. And I have every confidence we'll, again, if we have the will to make the decisions we need to make. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. That was a good wrap up of a very complicated subject, but we all like the numbers and they make sense to us. So thank you very much. But now it's time to move on to your questions. We will get to as many of them as we can in the time that remains. There's plenty of time. And the questions will be read and presented to the speakers by our Q&A manager, Amelia Brust. Amelia, it's yours.
Thanks, Diane. Once again, if you have any questions for our speakers, please put them in the Q&A box. And if your question is directed to a particular speaker, please indicate that as well. And we will try to get through as many as we can in the remaining time. Our first question says, has the county received any COVID-19 relief funds from the recent second stimulus? And are there any funds to help Montgomery County Public Schools reopen safely and according to CDC guidelines?
Yeah, as I quickly mentioned it before, but basically the original CARES Act had direct support for state and local governments, and then kind of ancillary support that provided for specific things that help state and local governments, but don't go directly to state and local governments necessarily. An example of that would be transit funding, which can be used for ride-on. There's K through 12 funding, there's childcare funding. There's a number of other areas of that. This second stimulus or second CARES funding did not add the direct funding for state and local governments, but did provide for some of those ancillary support. So it will help, but will not provide the same level of support that the first one did, and why there's still bipartisan advocacy from state and local governments around the country that we need direct support for state and local governments around the country.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is, how much additional revenue will be generated or is expected to be generated by changes in the budget process approved by voters in November?
Is that a question A? Is
Yeah.
that a property tax question for the county, or is that a state question?
The person did not specify, but I guess there's a local and state side to that. So
Could I just
taken in either direction?
Yeah, I'll let the treasurer, because there was a
let me
change
just-
to the way that budgets happen at the state. That's a big change.
No,
The ELG.
just briefly, Amelia, just to clarify, the constitutional amendment to allow the legislature to shift funds within the governor's budget to set legislative priorities was approved in November, but it doesn't go into effect until after the next gubernatorial election. So that would not have an impact.
Yeah, and the only other would be gambling, which still has to require an act of the General Assembly, which was also on the ballot, and state budget. All gambling expansions have to go to the Constitution of the state, have to be approved by the voters. So that remains to be seen exactly what those numbers look like. At the county level, the main change was the passage of question A, a rate-based property tax system. The effect of that is actually it's variable in terms of the revenue, since we don't start with how much we can collect and back into the number. Actually, ironically, in an economic downturn, property taxes would be able to go up. Your tax rates would be able to go up in order to fill the revenue gap that may have existed as a result. So it's still unclear exactly what that change is going to be. It allows us to collect the full benefit of when economic activity happens. The good news is there's new construction that is happening. Development is continuing in the county. We haven't seen significant changes to the development pipeline as a result of the pandemic, at least up to this point. And so those new projects that come online, the peculiar nature of the previous system, which only allowed us to increase the cap by the amount of collections on the first year of that new development, that no longer is in existence, which really hindered the county. So just to give you an example, if a building previously had been occupied, let's say in the final quarter of the year, for only a few months, it would only be collecting a quarter of the taxes because you pay a prorated on your first tax year, a prorated amount. You pay the full rate, but a prorated amount. Our property tax rate didn't annualize that in terms of how much it could grow with new construction. It just said the real amount could grow by the real amount that was collected only in the first year. And so what that meant is we had new buildings come online, but didn't get the full benefit of the new building coming online in terms of growing the tax base to provide services for residents and for that building. So if you look at the past past 17 years, it was about $13.5 million in additional money. Some years it's less, some years it's more. And so, it's over time, it's a benefit to the county because we can get the full economic benefit of new growth and new development. But that doesn't mean every single year it's better. So it remains to be seen exactly what that number is going to be. But as I said, Moody's and the credit bureaus have said that it's a significant net positive for the county's fiscal health.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is directed to Treasurer Kopp. Will you be refinancing debt given the low interest rates?
We have refinanced a lot of our debt, and you're right, the low interest rates have been very helpful, although the Congress in the Trump Economic Act actually prohibited advance refunding, or essentially prohibited advance refunding, which means we can only refund the bonds very close to the date they would become payable anyhow, or turned out anyhow. Even that has saved some money, but every time we go to market, and we're going again in February, by the way, a good, strong, conservative investment for anyone who is looking for both contributing to the state and knowing that they will be paid in full and on time. But at any rate, every time we go to market, we examine the question of refunding. And we usually find some bonds to refund. Maryland borrows money only for up to 15 years, which is shorter than many other jurisdictions. But what that means is it turns over more quickly, which the bond rating agencies like. But it also means we don't have a lot of very old, high interest rate bonds hanging out there.
Great, thank you. Our next question is to Mr. Friedson. If you could talk a bit more about the support that the county is prepared to give to local restaurants, and perhaps how restaurants could go about applying for that assistance, as well as maybe if the county has seen the number of restaurants needing assistance change at all over the last maybe 11 months as the pandemic has changed over time?
Well, there's no doubt that restaurants have been hit extremely hard. They're some of the hardest hit businesses. I spent a lot of time with a lot of them, unfortunately, and it's devastating to the business owners themselves and their life savings and their families, and to all of the workers who depend on it, and even carry out and does not allow for full staffing at a restaurant of what they're accustomed to doing. The county has stepped up and tried to provide a significant amount of support, and yet it is nowhere near enough. And that is just the unfortunate reality of what we're in. The FEG, the Public Health Emergency Grant Program that I wrote, that was passed by the full council, that was $25 million. There was a significant portion of that dedicated specifically, 10 million of it dedicated specifically to restaurants and storefront retail exclusively to help with the initial losses from March. We followed that up with a number of other grant programs, including several of which I advocated for, some of which I authored. We had a restaurant relief program, which came from state money that the governor allocated about $30 million statewide. We have 4.9 million. This latest iteration of that, prior to that, there was $50 million. The county got 8.2 million of that. The 8.2 million has been deployed. The 4.9 million is forthcoming. Those are about $10,000 or up to $10,000 grants for restaurants and food-based businesses. So it's broader than just a traditional restaurant. It could be a food truck, a caterer, similar to that. We had a grant program called the 3R initiative, which was run through the Montgomery County Economic Development Corporation. That was up to $5,000 grants. I worked on that with colleagues. I authored a reopening grant program to help businesses reopen after we had shut them down, or the governor actually had shut them down early on in the pandemic, to help offset the costs of the social distancing requirements to be able to keep residents safe. Those were up to $5,000 grants, a number of other programs as well. But we have targeted more support towards restaurants specifically than any other type of business. We have done quite a bit, tens of millions of dollars. We need to do more, and we need more help from the state, and we need more help from the federal government if we're going to have any chance of doing it. I've said before, the local government in a crisis is like an ambulance, and the state and the federal government are like the hospital. We have limited tools. We can get there fast. We're on the ground and close, but there's only so much we can do to stabilize those who are in need, both vulnerable residents and struggling businesses. We need the specialization and the serious tools. You don't get a surgeon in an ambulance. You get a surgeon in a hospital. And so, we need that backup. We need that support with limited tools. And certainly we need to do a lot more to help those businesses. But yeah, I hear those stories every day. I talk to restaurant owners every day. I represent a district that has more restaurants in it than any other local district in the state. And so I certainly take this home with me every night and spend a lot of time, unfortunately, hearing from restaurant owners who are desperately struggling to keep their lights on, keep our friends and neighbors employed, and to keep their businesses that they put everything into afloat.
Could I just jump in to say that statewide, I painted a good picture, which is true, I believe, statewide. But in fact, throughout the state, there are industries and areas which are disproportionately hit and harmed, obviously all over. The restaurants, the hospitality, those industries have been just, it's worse than being decimated, because that's only a 10% cut. They have really, really been hit terribly, terribly hard, even though at another level, the ongoing federal employment, the health and higher ed has been going along relatively strongly. And this then is reflected also in the social disparities, because you look at who is working in these different industries, and while there's a lot of overlap, it's not complete by any means. And so we have communities all over the state, including Montgomery County, as Andrew was saying, that are suffering deeply and in a very disproportionate way. And one of our responsibilities, I think, I told you what the revenue was coming in. The question is the costs going out. One of our responsibilities is to try to make the state a more inclusive and equitable place. So this has been hitting everybody, but it's very dramatic in the county, in the state's largest and most diverse county.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, because that point is so important. The other key issue, and one that I think this organization, more than some, would really be concerned about, is the gender disparities in this crisis have been huge, and some of the gains that have been made for women in the workforce, not enough, but significant gains over the past 20 or 30 years. There's a real fear, and if you look at the numbers, it will bear it out, that much, if not all of those gains over the past several decades may be lost. We may be back to ground zero. Then you look at racial disparities on the economic side and the health side, and educational disparities as well. I mean, it is a significant challenge that we're going to be grappled with, to the treasurer's point. None of those are unique to Maryland or to Montgomery County, but they are ones that we're going to have an obligation to try to address and hope to resolve.
Could I just throw out one addendum to that is more pertinent to Maryland than to many states? And that is, when you look at our demographics, we have a large portion of the workforce of Maryland that is, to use a not very pretty term, but as a senior citizen, I appreciate it, aging out of the workforce. And if we don't have well-educated, younger and middle-aged people and immigration, which we have been dependent on, our economy is not going to continue to be as strong as it is.
Thank you. Thank you. You both hit on a couple different points that we have questions related to, so I really want to make sure I get to those as well. So maybe the next one should be then for Mr. Friedson. What budget cuts do you think will be the least painful for the county to make in the coming budget year? Is there a consensus among the council as to where to make those cuts? And is there agreement or significant disagreement between the council and the county executive on where to make those cuts?
That is the $6 billion question. I don't know the answer. We have our first hearing meeting tomorrow to discuss the county executive's proposed savings plan. The system is really set up for, in a mid-year, for the county executive to lead the cuts, the magnitude of the cuts in particular, and then for the council to react, for the legislature to react. Most systems are set up that way with executives and legislative branches. It's really not set up for when an executive doesn't act. Right now we have a challenge because there is some disagreement of the magnitude of cuts that are needed in order to address the issue. As I mentioned before, we're talking about $143 million in shortfall in terms of what we had anticipated. We now have a $16.4 million operating budget cut. To me, that is inadequate. It is not going to be able to meet the fiscal challenges that we face. There isn't a consensus on what will be cut because we have yet to have a consensus on how much we would need to cut in order to meet the serious fiscal challenges that we face. There's also a question from a policy perspective of how much of the reserve should be used to fill the gap right now. The challenge with using reserves is twofold. One, we're expecting the worst of the fiscal challenges for the county to be beyond right now. We're expecting that to be later on in this fiscal year, next fiscal year, potentially the fiscal year that follows. If that's the case, then we need the reserves for the worst of the storm, and we don't want to be using, effectively using our life preservers that are temporary, in the beginning of the choppy waters, and not have them when they get worse. The other issue that we have is using reserves for ongoing expenses. This has been a challenge that the executive and I have had some pretty significant philosophical disagreements on. Reserves are for one-time budget shortfalls. They are to fill a one-time singular gap because they don't replenish themselves. They have to then, it is a cut of a future expenditure in order to refill the gap. We're basically borrowing from the reserves in a future year. I mean, that's effectively what it is. And so if you spend it on an ongoing expense, you will create a structural budget deficit that you can never dig out of. And so that's the challenge that we have now, is making sure that we're targeting the use of the reserves, both in a way that allows us to not only meet the moment that we're in, but meet the moments that follow, which I think are going to get tougher, and all of our evidence from our fiscal experts tell us as such. And then number two, to make sure that we are not creating new budget crises in the one that we're in by spending today one-time money on ongoing expenses, because we would be in a world of trouble moving forward. That would really hurt our ability to meet our future obligations in that case.
Thank you. And so speaking again to the apparent disparities across socioeconomic groups when it comes to impact of the pandemic, does Montgomery County expect that there will be any funds available to operationalize its new Racial Equity and Social Justice Office? And will the council rely on that office to gauge the impact on equity and social justice when it comes to making those budget cuts? I think you're muted, sir.
As a result of that bill, every budget decision has to be weighed through that lens. It's still being operationalized exactly what that is going to look like, but there is a racial equity manager. There is now, effectively an office that is overseeing this. I think everybody has recognized that this is a long journey to get to, the full effort of where we would want to go. But yes, every budget decision that the county executive proposes in his budget will have to go through that type of analysis. And during this crisis, we have focused on this a lot. We have an African American health initiative, specifically noting the fact that this pandemic has not hit every community equally. The hardest hit communities are communities of color. We have a Latino health initiative, the Salute Initiative, as it's colloquially called, which has both instances of targeted testing as well as resources to address the health aspect of this crisis. I mean, we have really tried to focus on that, recognizing that this pandemic, the only thing novel about it, the only thing new about it is the novel coronavirus itself. Everything else has taken the existing cracks in our society and it's just blown them wide open. So food insecurity is not new. Health disparities are not new. Racial inequity is not new. None of these issues are new, but in the crisis, it has put a wedge into those cracks and just, really created these gaping holes. That's the bad news. The good news is it has forced us to confront them in a way that perhaps we were able to ignore or gloss over to a certain extent before. We can't do that anymore. And so we'll continue to do that in every decision that we make moving forward. That's the reason why the bill was important. It was institutionalizing the change as part of the process, not doing something, but changing the way that we do everything to make sure that the racial equity lens is a key component to those decisions that we make as a government.
Thank you. Our next question is something that that both of you could address. How do you foresee the revenue shortfalls impacting MDOT in the coming year?
I'm looking at the Q&A. I think it's impacting MDOT, or I think it might be a follow-up question to impacting MDOT and the managed lane proposal specifically. Is that?
So it says how it could impact MDOT and the P3 highway widening on state and county fiscal level.
I'll yield to Madam Treasurer, and then I can follow up after.
First off, in terms of impacting, I'm sorry, I don't know if you can hear that, but a car siren just went off. It's very disconcerting. Sorry. The budget impact on transportation on MDOT as a whole is not clear yet. MDOT was hit very hard. MDOT, our State Department of Transportation, which for operating expenses is significantly dependent on the gas tax. Obviously, the gas tax receipts went down tremendously. There has been federal funding very recently in the latest bill, direct funding for WMATA Metro, which was extremely helpful, and MDOT is using its reserves. So not the pandemic itself, which has caused a lot of increased expenses, as you know, in terms of cleaning everything and taking care of people, but in terms of the revenue also was a tremendous hit. How it will be dealt with, I'm not sure. And in terms of the P3, I'll let Andrew address that. I have serious reservations about this project, although I think everybody knows that there are terrible backups on the American Legion Bridge and up 270 to 370, and something has to be done about that. I don't disagree with that. This probably is an opportune moment for me, Diane, to suggest to you all and to the league that we have a great Montgomery County delegation in Annapolis. And most particularly from my perspective in the finance area, on the House Ways and Means Committee is chaired by Ann Kaiser, and Janelle Wilkins is a leader on it, and Eric Ludke, the majority leader, all from Montgomery County on appropriations. We got Mark Corman and Jared Solomon. On budget and tax in the Senate, we have Nancy King. I would suggest that those folks would love to meet with you all, I bet. Once the governor's budget comes down, which will happen on Wednesday, Inauguration Day, and we really know what is in it and what Montgomery County will be facing.
Yeah, I will just add to the managed lane project. I have really focused on this from a fiscal standpoint, and the numbers don't add up right now. And that is one of the main challenges that we have. And the question is, who is going to pay for that? Is that going to be huge cost for huge tolls, which there's been a commitment that would not be the case, that we weren't going to see the $40, $50 tolls we've seen in Virginia and other places? Is it going to fall on the back of state taxpayers? Is the state budget going to fill the gap there?
No, the governor assures us there won't be a penny of.
So that to me is the main issue. And if you look at in the details of the draft environmental impact statement, the EIS as it's referred to, it raises this question, kind of like a blaring signal, quite loudly. And so regardless of how you feel about the project, from my perspective, whether you think it's a great idea or the worst idea, or whether you'd want something but not this, and there's lots of room on both sides, and then I think there's lots of room in the middle, quite frankly. There is a math problem that has not been addressed, and that concerns me. And since this forum is really focused on math problems, public budget challenges that we face, there is a math problem that will be addressed. And the question is, how does that get addressed, and who's left, holding the bag, so to speak? And that is still an unanswered question, and one that I know Treasurer Kopp and her platform on the Board of Public Works, which has to approve this at various stages of it, will be raising as she has up to this point. And obviously there are some big questions about the project moving forward that have to be answered and haven't yet been answered.
Great, thank you. We have several questions related to schools, so I want to make sure I ask a couple of those. First one, since school was largely online this year, how do either of you expect that to shake out in the budget, if there will be perhaps different things allotted in the next budget that were not accounted for in previous school years, and things that maybe you do not expect to see in the new budget that may have been accounted for in the past?
My immediate reaction in terms of the state budget is to say, hold your breath until Wednesday, when the governor's budget will be sent to the General Assembly. I know everyone is aware of all the problems of remote learning and the cost of remote learning, the cost of going back to the classroom, the impact on spending because we don't have the same enrollment that we had, and yet we're going to next year. So all of these issues about the formula and additional funds are going to be dealt with in the General Assembly after they receive the governor's budget on Wednesday. But clearly cost of maintenance of effort is impacted, and that's very important to our county.
Yeah, that's a critical point. So the maintenance effort is based on student enrollment. Our student enrollment is down. The question is, what impact that ultimately will have on funding for the school system, because the costs are not necessarily going to go down reflective of the current enrollment picture. So there's some, there's a system that was set up, and the unique moment, the unprecedented moment that we're in, does not really fit into the system. That system has challenges in a normal year in terms of what it means for our ability to fund our obligations when it comes to education. It's particularly acute in terms of the impact that it has on a county like Montgomery County now. And so we're going to have to grapple with that. The question to, what impact does it have on the cost? We received some additional funding from the original CARES Act. If I recall, it's about $21 million directly to MCPS. There is a second round of funding through the second directly to K through 12. We're still finalizing what that number will be for MCPS. It basically passes through the state to the county. We'll get final understanding of exactly what that number is in the governor's budget, because most likely it will be baked into the budget as federal funding pass through to the county, or at least accompany the budget in terms of its announcement. That the treasurer may have inside knowledge that I don't have, but we're awaiting that. And we've also allocated some funding throughout, like for HVAC improvements, ventilation improvements, and others throughout. But there are some big questions on how much it's going to cost. Some costs are down, some costs are up, and what the net impact is going to be. Ultimately, the decision of when to go back to school and how to go back to school is the decision of the school board, a duly elected state agency that the council has very little authority over under state law. Our job is to make sure that they have the resources that are needed to be able to get kids back to school as quickly as they can. I certainly hope that it's sooner rather than later. The decision was just made, as I'm sure most people here know, to move from mid-January now into mid-March to start bringing students back to school. There's going to be a late February meeting to discuss, whether or not the metrics are hit. I will say that there are state public health and Department of Health folks who are in touch with the school system, along with county health folks as well. Ultimately, though, those decisions are made by the superintendent, who, to complicate things for personal understandable reasons, has just decided that he was going to leave. And so there are certainly some big questions of how we get kids back to school, which I think everybody agrees should be our top priority.
We did receive at the state level, it's going to be incorporated in the budget, and I can't say about the specific numbers, but significant federal funds for K through 12. But of course, that's spread all over the state and is targeted towards COVID-related expenses.
Yeah, the question hopefully we'll get is the jurisdiction by jurisdiction.
Right.
Montgomery County will receive, which I at least don't have that final number yet, but hopefully we'll get it on Wednesday, and then we'll have to plan accordingly. Generally, what happens is the state will provide it to the county, and then the council will appropriate it as pretty much a formality. We won't have the ability to change the number.
Thank you. The next question, if the state legislature overrides the governor's veto of the Kerwin legislation, which would require some funding increases, including funding increases at the local level, Mr. Friedson, would you expect Montgomery County to be able to meet that requirement?
Well, we're going to have to. So, you know, the lens with which I view all of the decisions that we make is whether or not we're going to be able to fund education moving forward. And we've made some big commitments on what that would look like. And the bigger gap we create today, the less flexibility we create today by a lack of fiscal leadership and fiscal discipline that is needed right now in this part of the crisis, the more challenging it's going to be able to meet the local obligations. Now, I would hope that if the state is doing a lot better than the local jurisdictions, that the state will pay a bigger share. When the state was having as tougher time, they dumped a number of significant costs for education, like teacher pensions, onto the counties. And I hope that we'll see a, you know, kind of an opposite shift here if that's the case. But again, as I have said repeatedly, hope is not a fiscal strategy, and every decision that we make that doesn't meet the fiscal challenges that we currently face will make it harder and harder to be able to fund the education costs that we have committed to, and that we all, you know, I believe everybody in county leadership believes strongly that we need to do. The only other thing that I will say about this is what is often lost in the Kerwin conversation is the school construction. It was the Build to Learn Act and then the Built to Learn Act. It's in fact very similar legislation, but is a huge boon to school construction, predominantly for large jurisdictions like ours that have historically not received our proportionate share of state funding to meet our school enrollment and school capacity numbers. This would be arguably an even bigger impact in terms of the county's fiscal picture, in terms of our ability to fund education, both the buildings where people learn and the instruction that happens in it, both of which are important aspects of how our children learn and where they learn and what tools they have in order to learn. Those bills are connected based on legislative minutia that we don't need to get into, but that is a very important priority of the county. To be able to have the school construction costs. Just to give you a sense, historically, the county makes up about 18 or 19%, depending on the year, of school enrollment growth. We only get about 13% of state funding for school construction. It's slightly improved in recent years based on some work. The treasurer has been a leader on these issues, Delegate Mark Corman, who's pushed for some changes, not just on relative wealth, which doesn't tell the full picture because the median doesn't tell how everybody is doing in a county, and Montgomery County is harmed by those calculations, but also enrollment growth. And you know, we need to be able to keep up with the enrollment growth that we have to be able to build and renovate the schools that we have. And so I just think it's important not to lose sight of the construction funding for local jurisdictions, particularly Montgomery County, in addition to Kerwin, which is operating expenses of how much it costs to operate a school, to pay teachers, to provide programs and services.
Could I just add to that, to what Andrew said? I mentioned the legislators from Montgomery County on the fiscal committees who have done a terrific job, I think, and are continuing to, and have education, I believe it's fair to say, is their #1 priority. Our county's chief administrative officer, Mr. Matalino, is also an expert on the state budget and on education costs. And I would urge you to talk to him too. And I'm sure Mr. Friedson does a great deal.
Thank you. Sorry, one second. Mr. Friedson, there was I believe one of your slides detailed a pay increase for certain public-facing county employees related to their work around the pandemic. Would you mind kind of explaining that a bit, explaining the reasoning behind that pay increase, or what those positions were that received that, and perhaps how far into the future the county would expect to fund that?
So if the other question was the $6 billion question, this is the $100 million question. We don't know how long it will go. The county executive's agreement went into perpetuity. To be clear, the county council decided that we were going to have a same services budget. The county executive sent us over a budget that, understandably, to a certain extent, was written over the course of months. The pandemic had occurred. There was still a lot of fiscal uncertainty. The council decided during the budget season last season, which runs from mid-March to May, that we were going to provide or approve a same services budget. We weren't going to add to the fiscal challenges that the county faced. Included in a same services budget was not approving raises, pay raises for public employees that were negotiated by the county executive. The goal of that was not to have to do furloughs and layoffs and other things. In the depths of the Great Recession, for instance, County Executive Leggett, along with the council, but really led by County Executive Leggett, eliminated 1,100 positions from county government. I mean, a huge cut to the workforce. Implemented a significant number of furloughs, which is an effective pay cut to county employees. We wanted to avoid that as much as possible. And so we did what we did during the budget, which was not an easy decision, and certainly not one that any of us took lightly. Separate from that, the county executive, along with the public employee unions during the pandemic, agreed to providing differential pay, or basically COVID-19 hazard pay, through a provision of their contract that allowed for provision for additional pay during an emergency. Now, emergencies in the contract were intended to be things like hurricanes, snowstorms, when the county government is shut down and only a certain number of people who are dealing with the emergency itself have to report to work. It was never intended to be, 3, 6, 9, 12 months, or perhaps even longer. Many jurisdictions, including the state of Maryland, including our Park and Planning Commission, including other counties around the state and the region, implemented some type of hazard pay, but almost all of them had an end date, or a series of end dates. Some of them have repeatedly come back and negotiated them. Most of them have expired at this point. The county provided the highest amount, $10 an hour for public facing and $3 an hour for non-public facing, for those who aren't able to telework. So we have the highest, and it goes into perpetuity. And so the cost is effectively incalculable at this point. It's annualized at $100 million a year, which is, as I mentioned during the slides, 3.5 times or more larger than the pay increases that we did not approve because we didn't think that they were affordable given the fiscal challenges that the county faces. The county executive committed to the council that they would not continue that agreement until they got council approval. council approval means we decide how to spend the, where the money comes from. Because I have said, it's not really my job to determine what that agreement is. It is my job to determine whether or not there's money in the budget in order to afford it. And if not, there has to be an offsetting cut to be able to make it happen. To this point, we were supposed to receive it. We were supposed to receive it before December 31st. Then we were supposed to receive it on January 15th. To date, we have not received anything from the county executive. We're told that they are in discussions and in negotiations. But the longer this goes, the bigger it gets, the bigger the number is, and the harsher the cut is going to have to be in some other service, in some other aspect of the budget in order to offset it. When we're dealing with something, we're facing a fiscal cliff. And the idea of a savings plan, the idea of cuts is supposed to be to lower the point at which you fall off the cliff so that when you go off that cliff, it doesn't kill you. It bruises you. It hurts a little bit, but it doesn't kill you. If we fail to lower the cliff, to soften the blow, so to speak, at the moment we do fall off that cliff, it is going to hurt. And it's going to hurt vulnerable residents, in my view, the most. And that's what I'm particularly concerned about. If vulnerable residents who, can least afford it during a pandemic, our education funding that we need to continue, more than ever. I mean, as the gap in education is growing, not diminishing, unfortunately, because of decisions that have been made related to the school, some of which are not avoidable. And so we have some real concerns there. I share your concern as much as any. I don't think anybody has raised these issues more than I have, but ultimately the county executive negotiated this deal. The county executive has to renegotiate it or end the deal, depending on what his preference may or may not be. And either way, we need a plan, a fiscal plan on how to pay for it. Up to this point, we've yet to see one.
Great, thank you. We have about 9 minutes left in our discussion tonight. So anyone who has some last minute questions they want to get in, please submit them. Our next one is regarding the county's tax structure. If it is balanced now, will there be adjustments from any lessons learned going forward, such as will the energy tax be changed, or will there be sales taxes on services, even services conducted over the web?
Thank you. Great question. The county does not have the authority to charge sales tax. Sales tax is exclusively charged by the state. The 6% sales tax that you pay all goes to the state. And I mentioned earlier, it's one of the reasons why the state is doing better, and the fact that it's better than expected, at least. And the online sales tax, which was a hard-fought, long battle that the treasurer, the comptroller, the General Assembly, many were involved in, that has really made a difference, as there's been a significant shift to online spending, which has had a very devastating impact, unfortunately, on our Main Street retailers and businesses, but has had a neutral impact, maybe even a positive impact on the state budget.
Most particularly in education, by the way.
In terms of the lessons learned, I wish we had more lessons learned from the depths of the Great Recession. I think County Executive Leggett at the time made a lot of very difficult decisions then, some of which, frankly, I wholeheartedly agreed with, some of which, I may have had a different approach, but all of which were with the county's fiscal health in mind. I think they were prudent. I think that they were responsible. I think that you could certainly, argue one way or another on an individual decision that was made, and frankly, I have. But it was the type of leadership that we needed at the time desperately, and he showed it to his credit. And I don't think you are often remembered for the things you avoided for the county, but he ought to be remembered as somebody who safeguarded the county's fiscal health at a nearly impossible time of leadership for local jurisdictions, and far better than almost any other jurisdiction in the country. One of the decisions he made at the time, by the way, was the energy tax. The energy tax is now the third largest revenue generator in the county. It's far less than property tax and income tax, but it's substantial. There was a promise for it to be phased out. I've been critical for why the county has not fulfilled its promise for that. I would honestly tell you that I think it's unlikely that it will be phased out during the economic downturn right now. Unfortunately, it's already lower because there's less energy consumption in commercial buildings right now, as I mentioned, and so the collections are down to begin with. And I think that I just don't think there's a political will, for better or for worse, even though I have called for that previously at the current moment. I will also say the interesting thing about the energy tax is it's the only tax that we can charge the federal government. We don't charge property taxes. We don't charge income tax, corporate income tax for the employer. We do charge energy tax for the federal government. And so it actually does have an interesting benefit there. But I think the lesson learned aspect of this, to me, the biggest lesson learned is the leadership that Ike Leggett showed as a fiscal steward, as a county executive. And up to this point, I think that the current county executive could look at County Executive Leggett's example and perhaps follow some of the things that he did, which were controversial, which were difficult, which were challenging, but ultimately have left the county in a far better financial position than we otherwise would have been.
Great, thank you. Our next question, which may be our last question, depending on how weighty it is to answer. There is an understanding among some that Montgomery County contributes more to the state than it receives back. Is that true? And do either of you expect any adjustments to that balance?
Let me start off with what might not be a popular response, but this is a question. I ran for office first in 1974, and we've been talking about this question ever since. Montgomery County residents pay the same income tax that people all over the state do. It's a statewide level of taxation, and the sales tax is the same too. We have traditionally had more upper middle class, and now even some quite wealthy people, and so more funds have come in per capita from Montgomery County than, for instance, from Dorchester County or Baltimore City. But the tax rates are the same. We do have significant costs, and we ought to make sure that we get what we deserve and are owed. But I don't think when you're looking at it statewide and looking at the tax responsibilities for individual citizens of Montgomery County, that they in fact do pay disproportionately. This is not the most popular position in the world, I know.
Yeah, all I will say is this. Many of the funding formulas in the state harken back to a very different Montgomery County, one that was far less diverse, had far fewer residents that face real significant needs. It looked a lot more, frankly, like Howard County and some other counties. And quite honestly, what that meant was there was less wealth at the top. I mean, our wealthy residents 30 years ago were not nearly as wealthy as they are today. And our poor residents were fewer in number and not nearly as poor as they are today. Montgomery County is in many ways a microcosm of the country and the income inequality that has happened. That has created a major challenge for us with state funding, because we're still viewed as a place that has mostly upper income average folks. And the wealthiest of the wealthy may not have been as wealthy, but most people were fairly well off, in terms of the mode, and so, when you look at how these formulas are calculated, there's a big difference on how you average things out. If you go, what is a normal resident, and how much does that normal resident make, and how easy is it to afford to live in a place with a high cost of living like Montgomery County? That is much tougher than what is the mean, what is the average amount. If you add up all the income and all of the wealth, and then you divide it by the number of residents, you would get a far different picture and a different number. And so I do believe that we need a better nuanced understanding of the modern dynamics of what Montgomery County is from the state, which has been hard because there has been a prevailing understanding, that we have, roads that are paved in gold, and every resident here is wealthy, and and we can, we have a big budget and we can handle all of our needs. And that just frankly isn't the case. What people lose sight of is the fact that we have more students on free and reduced meals in Montgomery County than the city of Baltimore does, by a lot. I mean, it's not even close. Now, their percentage is higher, but our numbers are higher. We have more students on free and reduced meals in Montgomery County than the entire enrollment of DC public schools. Nobody talks about that at the state. I spent a lot of time, not nearly as much as the treasurer, but I worked in Annapolis for 8 years, and I spent a lot of time there. And that is not the way that people talk about Montgomery County. And so I think that we have to help change the narrative a little bit of what Montgomery County is, a little bit of a reality check of, Montgomery County today is not Montgomery County of what it was. And, when I grew up, frankly, when the treasurer first ran for office, when the treasurer served in, on the appropriations committee, is a far different county today than it was. And we need support from the state to reflect that. And some of that is not intentional. It's not, we're going to leave Montgomery County out. It's just that the funding formulas and the way in which these decisions are made does not reflect oftentimes the reality of the type of county we have today. And we have our work cut out for us to change that.
Let me say this, that does not conflict with what I said. I agree entirely with Andrew that we do have to look at expenditures as well as revenue.
Well, thank you both for such insightful remarks, especially on a kind of complicated subject of both revenues coming in and expenditures going out, both at the state level and the county level. So on behalf of the League of Women Voters, Montgomery County, I thank all of you for attending, especially our two speakers, for Amelia, the Q&A manager, and for sticking to this meeting this evening. I hope you have a good evening. Stay safe and well. Good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.